The Northern California Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Community Foundation is dedicated to empowering individuals and communities by promoting civil and human rights, fostering social and economic justice, and encouraging holistic well-being. Through a range of dynamic programs and events, we strive to unlock the promise in every person and create a more equitable and inclusive society. From our flagship events, the Martin Luther King Jr. Celebration and the King and Faith and International Colloquium Series, to the Black and Brown Comics Arts Festival, the Center for Social Impact Development and Global Engagement, and the MLK Social Justice Center and Gallery, the Foundation strives to foster a more just, inclusive, and compassionate society and world, where individuals are empowered and where all communities can thrive. Support the NorcalMLK Foundation at NorcalMLKFoundation.org/donate.
To speak with you, and thanks for a very generous introduction. I have been really excited to be able to know Dr. Griselle, spend some time over a few years now meeting, talking with him, and understanding more of the work that he's leading, understanding more of a lot of the really human-centered issues that numerous communities such as yours in the legal sector are addressing in order to tackle very, very complicated challenges that our society is facing. It's both an exciting time to be alive, I think, given all of the innovation that's happening and the different movements that are coming forward. It's also a vexing and disturbing time. There's a lot going on in the world. Some of it is kind of more iterations of things we've seen before. Other things seem to be different from what we've seen before, with lots of political consequences, and it's both very close to home and also far-reaching. So it's always nice, in my view, to be able to spend time with people who are thoughtful, trying to understand how do we forge ways forward that create a better world, that can create more opportunities in a more inclusive way for everyone to be able to participate in our society and to flourish. And so, again, very grateful to be able to talk with you. Looking forward to your own comments. I'm going to spend about 15 minutes, as Aaron indicated, just observing and elevating some aspects that are very salient. Not to be exhaustive, we could spend years kind of sifting through the intersection of human rights and civil rights and technology. But in a brief moment of time together this afternoon to think together about some of the things that are especially pressing. And so I would just start with indicating what you've probably heard many, many times, and that you're here in Silicon Valley, you've witnessed and walked through and experienced every day. It was called the Fourth Industrial Revolution. That terminology has been used to refer to the extraordinary scale and very rapid pace of technology innovation that we're seeing, particularly in the digital technology sector. So that includes AI and AI adjacent developments, and robotics, which is part of that. As Aaron was just mentioning, things like biotech and precision medicine that I'll say more about more specifically. But if we think about that terminology of Fourth Industrial Revolution and why it has been used, it is especially important that it points to ways that industry is changing how we make things, how we consume things, the economic factors, labor, who gets to participate and how people participate in the economy, things that are connected to that. So education serves many different roles. It's not only to help people to participate in the economy, but as an educator, I would say that is an important function. It's not the only function. We like to talk about the life of the mind and nurturing curiosity. And I think it is still important to understand how can education help people to participate economically. So there's always been direct effects on educational systems as manufacturing, as industry, as the productive aspects of economy shift. So the technology is changing that. It is shifting the skills that people need and the expectations, their ability to earn money, how that looks, and who creates value, who gets to own that value, how it gets distributed. The scale at which that's happening is beyond anything most people imagine. So we're in the middle of Salesforce's campus right now, their park. Had you gone into a boardroom in the 1990s here at Salesforce anywhere and said, General Motors, name your company, ExxonMobil, and said, one day we're gonna have companies worth trillions of dollars. Most experts would have laughed at you and said, but that's absurd. That's such a great amount of money that no single company could ever have that much value. Get out of here. You're being ridiculous. But we have multiple companies now that are worth trillions of dollars each. And that's so much value, that's so much money. I personally don't know how much money that is. If you ask me what I would buy with $1 trillion besides 1/5 of NVIDIA, I couldn't tell you because I really don't know how much money that is. It's just so much that for me, it's just a word. But it's a lot. It's beyond what most people could imagine. And so that's also part of what we're seeing with the fourth industrial revolution. And some experts think we are only beginning to see the growth of scale of value. So there are all kinds of things that are connected to that. But that term also could be understood, fourth industrial revolution, to refer to cultural, social factors. That is, how does it change the way people imagine and understand reality? So when factories began to emerge and mass production became a thing, when people could work in a factory, you could get jobs and putting widget A on widget B, and lots of commodities, because of mass production, became less expensive. More people could have more things. That had all kinds of consequences. More people began to move further away from home. Now you could drive a car to go to work. You didn't have to ride a horse or walk, and so you could commute. Now today we'd probably look back and tell those people decades ago, watch out, you're gonna be sitting in traffic for a few hours. But they didn't know that back in the 1920s and 30s. The point is that families started to look different. We went from multiple generations in a household, and now you gotta pay people to be your multiple generations in your household for childcare and elder care and those kinds of things. So there were cultural shifts that happened. And so those things, we're seeing those patterns with AI. And then there are other aspects of this, but just understanding that terminology of the fourth industrial revolution and what that implies is significant. There are some salient issues that are in the legal sector, the sector of rights, human rights, civil rights, philosophical notion of what is the ideal set of liberties that a flourishing human subject should be able to have access to. Those things are shifting, and you're the experts on these categories. Things like privacy, for example, are very important, and access, and very specific operationalized forms of what is equitable, what counts as discrimination. One of you was talking earlier about data sets and algorithmic bias. If people are trying to get approved for whatever, it could be, you're trying to get some health care and there's an algorithm that decides whether that specific procedure, which has a code attached to it in some data center, and it gets sent from a provider to somebody's software platform, so an insurance company that can decide whether or not they're going to approve it. Those factors are becoming more complicated because there's more software involved in those processes. That doesn't mean there aren't humans. In fact, it only underscores the role that humans play. But the point is that when it comes to rights on areas of privacy or equal access to all kinds of services, AI is playing a greater role. We are moving from something called deterministic systems, which means the software knows that 3 + 3 is always going to equal 6, or it knows that orange is supposed to be matched to yellow. And when it sees orange, it knows that the match is supposed to be yellow. When it sees yellow, it knows that the other thing is supposed to be orange. It's just a simple rule to follow. And you give it the rules and it does that. That's like playing chess. Here are the rules. You might need a long list of them, but you put that in the software and it just does the thing. It doesn't need to be imaginative. In fact, it's not supposed to imagine anything. It's just putting this to that because you told it to. So those are deterministic systems, and that is classic. I say classically, that sounds like a long time ago. That is, in earlier iterations of technologies, how we have permitted software systems to do things that humans have decided. We're now in something called generative AI, which is non-deterministic. It'll figure out stuff. You give it some context, and then it generates something that didn't exist before. It could be a song or text or an image, or in this case, some kind of decision that it has to come to. And those non-deterministic systems are incredibly useful because you don't program them. They teach themselves. And so you can throw unstructured situations and problems at them, and then they'll figure out things and start to give you some decision outputs that are on the level of complexity that human beings have been able to produce. Problem is, because it's non-deterministic, it's not based on rules, it's just figuring stuff out in the way that you and I might figure out something. If I try to figure out something, I might get it wrong. I get lots of stuff wrong. So do these systems, okay? And yet, when it comes to the access that people have to different services or different decision trees, applying for a loan or doing something else, those non-deterministic generative systems are already on the path to playing a bigger role and will raise a lot of questions, and are already creating questions about what's fair, what should be legal, what should be permitted, etc. And more granular at the level of things like privacy and access, we are seeing concerns over things like state surveillance, so governments surveilling people. You probably have been following this quite closely. There's so much going on. There's just so many things to follow. But one of the areas of particular concern to elevate at the federal level in the United States is the fact that the federal government has contracted with multiple companies, with one of those being Palantir is not the only one, but they play a leading role in being able to connect a lot of dots about lots of data sets to be able to figure out an incredible amount of information about any individual who might be targeted by their software systems. And so for the first time in the US, we have at our federal level the federal government's ability to have a private company to say, look, we want to know a lot of things about a lot of people. And we want to be able to target individual people to know all kinds of things about them that they might not even know about themselves, so that we can decide what we're going to do to those people. It may or may not comport with what has been interpreted as constitutional, but it is happening. And so, for example, it is now possible, I'm not important, well, I'm not going to say I'm not important enough to be surveilled by the government, because no one knows you to make those assumptions. I'm not an especially prominent person in any particular category, but let's just say the federal government wanted to find out lots of things about Sylvester Johnson. So they could just throw a lot of my data in there, and it could, Palantir systems, they could capture all of my social media messaging, any public information about me, any websites. They could access even private data sets about me. They can triangulate all that information, and suddenly they know all of my networks. They know where I've traveled, when I traveled, whom I met with, whom I spoke to. They can have a more intricate, sophisticated knowledge of my comings and goings, associations, the content of my speech, my writings, my posts, they can get my medical information, all of that stuff. I can't even know those things about myself because I haven't put them together. My brain's not big enough to hold all of it in context at one time to take a snapshot and understand me, but they can. All right, so that's just one example of the power of state surveillance. Governments are not the only entities that surveil people. Non-state actors surveil people. Private companies surveil people. You right now as a private system, if you wanted to we don't hear a lot of conversation about data brokers. We usually hear about so-called big tech, but data brokers are simply companies that package data about people that can usually be publicly available. And they might also buy some private data sets. They put that together and they bundle it into a data set, and then they sell that
to whoever wants to buy it. If you wanted to, you could buy from a data broker my phone records, my movements. As I move around the country, as I have a smartphone, this thing yells out to cell phone towers, I'm Sylvester Johnson's phone, here I am. If he gets a text or a phone call, tell me so I can ring. So it just announces itself. So you can buy the data set that contains all of my movements that the cell phone towers have been getting from my phone. You can buy that. It only costs about $100. It's not illegal for you to do it. Anybody can do that. It has this $100. Well, imagine if you had millions of dollars, what you could do. But the point is that the capacity to gather that information and use it to surveil people, particularly for nefarious purposes, that's growing exponentially. And so things like surveillance and privacy and protecting especially vulnerable populations, those are going to become extraordinarily complicated challenges within the context of our concern for human rights and civil liberties. And so that's just one example of the way these categories are beginning to intersect. And another area that is extraordinarily both exciting and also challenging when we're thinking about human rights and civil liberties concerns health and biotech, and something I like to call human engineering, because we now have the ability to design and reconfigure people, and not just people, but plants and our agricultural products and non-human animals. But we have the ability now to redesign, reconfigure people from the cellular genetic level up. Their cells, their tissues, diseases are now being treated through changing people's DNA. So a little over 2 years ago, in December of 2023, the Food and Drug Administration approved the first genetic engineering treatment to cure sickle cell anemia. Sickle cell is a disease in which the red blood cells are malformed. Instead of being nicely round and circular, they are more sickle cell, like a crescent shape, and they can't carry oxygen as well, which is what red blood cells are supposed to do. It can be a very painful disease to have, and is typically fatal, where people die decades sooner than they should. So 2 different treatments for genetic engineering were approved, and people are now being successfully treated so that they are in one sense cured of that disease. In other words, their DNA is changed so their bodies will produce normal shaped blood cells, red blood cells. But you can also do other things with this same technology that are going to be on the horizon. The ability to design new treatments to create new forms of DNA that never existed before, for example, is becoming possible, especially because of AI. And you don't need AI to design new genes, but the AI can do it much faster. So instead of one person taking 12 or 15 years to figure out the shape of one protein or how to reconfigure one new gene, the AI can do that in a few minutes. It can come up with thousands of new proteins that never existed before in nature. It can create ways, potentially in the future, for people to not have to worry about having cancer again, or heart disease, or diabetes, or high blood pressure, because you can literally change the proteins in their body. And if you change your DNA, so this is me talking about what will be possible in the future, their children can inherit those capacities. I mean, can you imagine how much money it would be worth if instead of passing on to your children a house or a car, you pass on to them the ability to never, ever be susceptible to cancer or heart disease, ever? If a house is worth, I don't know, if I were in Chicago, I'd say $1 million. This is San Francisco. Should I say 10, 20? I don't know how many houses are worth. But if the house is worth $1 million or more, how much is it worth for all of your descendants to never have to worry about having those diseases? Those things are going to become possible. And I'd like to point attention to someone named Henrietta Lacks. So this was an African-American woman who was born and grew up in Roanoke, Virginia. She lived in the early to mid 20th century. She developed cervical cancer. She went to a doctor, and although at the time it was legal for quite hospitals to deny her health care at the time. She was eventually able to get health care from Johns Hopkins University in their hospital. And in attempting to treat her, and she died of cervical cancer before she could be treated, but in attempting to treat her, the doctors discovered in performing a biopsy that her cells never died. They just kept replicating. They'd never seen this before. There had been a quest for what you could call the Holy Grail in biotech at the time, to develop a line of cells that would stay alive long enough for you to perform long, complicated experiments to develop all kinds of things. At the time, they were trying to develop a vaccine for polio. It wasn't possible for many reasons. The greatest barrier is that the cells wouldn't stay alive long enough for you to run the test and figure out how to develop the vaccine. Her cells never died. The doctor gave her cells to other doctors. Eventually, companies that started to produce her cells and sell those as packages. Over the decades, virtually every advance in biological technologies for treating and curing diseases, to produce things like vaccines or new drug treatments, or just understanding the pathology of disease, all of those advancements happen almost invariably in some way because of her cells. So the polio vaccine was able to be produced because of her cells. But all kinds of vaccines, HPV vaccine, the coronavirus vaccine. This is how biological research is done. You can go to any university research lab or hospital research lab or private company's research lab, and they are using her cells because her cells are the only cells that will stay alive long enough for you to produce long, complicated research. Everyone else's cells dies, including the cells of non-human animals. Henrietta Lacks, as I said at the time, was legally denied treatment by most hospitals because it was legal to discriminate against Black people at the time. Her family was very poor. They had no idea until decades later that the whole world was using the cells of their mother or grandmother or great-grandmother, depending on where you were in your line of descent. But the whole world benefited from that technology. And her family was never able to benefit. They lived in poverty. She died in poverty. Just a few years ago, one of the tech companies that's in biotech, Fisher Scientific, signed a non-disclosed agreement with her family to settle, basically to provide some financial benefit to them because billions of dollars in wealth have been generated because of the use of her cells. So that's a long-winded example. Why am I pointing to that? Because one of the things that is going to unfold in the coming years and decades is collecting genetic information from lots of humans to create a huge data set so that AI can see enough data to figure out how to create new proteins, design new forms of DNA to manage disease, to advance health in the years to come. Private companies have been using Henrietta Lacks' cells because they were unlike any other. But she never benefited, nor did her descendants. Until very, very recently, and no one knows the amount, but it was relatively modest compared to the massive amount of wealth that's been generated. The population of people in the world who have the most valuable genetic data are people who live in the continent of Africa. Because that's where our species began, so there's more genetic diversity, because there's just more time for variety to happen. Is it likely that people in African nations will be able to own the value of that? Will we see a kind of repeat of Henrietta Lacks where the technology that is deriving value from vulnerable people ends up creating massive wealth, but the people themselves whom it was based on don't get to participate in the benefit? I don't know, that's a question. Hopefully we'll do things differently. But my point there is that when it comes to human rights and civil rights, one of the most profound questions we'll have to answer in the coming years is what rights people have to their information. And the most valuable information, it'll take some time for most of us to realize this, But the most valuable information that exists in the world, I'm going to suggest, is not your shopping data, is not your financial data, is not your voting data. It is your genetic information, most valuable data. And it will create very complicated kind of legal questions and human rights questions. As our world starts to fight more and more over resources, this question of who gets to participate is going to become more important. And I'll end with this. When it comes to regulating and governing AI, so regulations, policies, and laws, governance is this more broad idea of how do you manage something, how do you guide it in a way to get us results that we want. We will have to come to terms with the need to figure out and structure the management of AI that is shaped by a commitment to human rights, and not just which country has the most weapons or which nations have the most wealth. It will become one of the most difficult challenges of our time. And when I say that not just in terms of using LLMs and chatbots to send messages and to write reports or to make slide decks, but in order to design the future of human health and literally to design humans, to figure out what changes people are going to experience in their bodies, in their cells, who will be able to have access to it, what the standard of care will become, if it becomes possible to receive an AI-generated engineering or re-engineering of your genetic data, of your DNA. Should that become a standard? Should that be a human right? Should it be treated like housing? Like access to food? Or should it be treated as a luxury? Like driving, a Bugatti. If you can afford it, great. But we don't insist that everybody be able to drive a $500,000 car. How are we going to recognize what counts as a right, as a human right, and how people should participate? So it's both an exciting time to be alive, and it is also a very challenging one. Although one of your next door neighbors, understand OpenAI is right down the street in some direction, somewhere around here, made available to healthcare consumers what's called OpenAI for Health. So they created a separate cloud, the data storage container, so that people, consumers, everyday people, can sign up to connect all of their healthcare data to ChatGPT. It is being stored in a separate repository from where, if you were using that product today, whatever you're uploading, emails, what have you, reports. This is a separate place because it is HIPAA compliant. Okay. And about a day after that, they announced the OpenAI for Health Care. So this is for providers. This is for providers to be able to use a HIPAA compliant version of ChatGPT in order to manage the massive amount of patient data so that healthcare providers can say, when I walk into the office, well, Sylvester Johnson, I haven't seen you in a year or 6 months. I just took 5 minutes to read your chart. I only have 15 minutes perhaps to go to the next thing. That they can walk in and have a granular analysis of a massive amount of data at their fingertips. Okay. So, but my point is twofold. One, you're asking, what do we need to do to ensure equity in the representation of people in these data sets and in the decisions that get made for care? Who has access to what? How is said person going to be treated? 2 weeks ago, it would look very differently. OpenAI just opened this up, and I think in 3 or 4 days, 5 days later, Anthropic released a version of their AI called Claude that is a similar type of service. It is for healthcare, okay? So one answer is and I say this as someone, as Aaron was introducing me, I founding CEO of a company, Corporation Public Interest Technology. I think that it's important to have more people who are participating in designing, creating, developing, making things. That needs to be more inclusive. I think that if we can have more equitable representation in the people who are creating data sets, who are building software systems or hardware systems, or who are providers. Look at your entire ecosystem, whatever. If there is more equitable participation in that ecosystem, wherever it is, at whatever point or node, I think our world is going to be better. I think we're going to get more equitable outcomes if we can have more equitable inputs. Okay, so that's the first thing I would say. A very operationalized way another way of saying that, since we're in, that's probably, you can toss a marble in San Francisco and hit 3 or 4 founders with one marble. I think we need to nurture more founders in a more inclusive way. I don't think that's the only answer, but I do think the inputs are important. And then I would say on the other side, we need, even though there is a federal effort to not only stifle, but to punish the efforts that are happening, which right now are states, to regulate this technology. It is simply the case, not just with healthcare, but especially with healthcare, there has to be some rules around it. And we do have rules, right? HIPAA is a great example of that. And it's not an accident that OpenAI says, oh, this is HIPAA compliant. And that's a federal law, it's not a state law. And there are other things that have to do. But we have to create some new policy that is attuned to this new delivery. And I think there's a lot more to be said. The only layer I would add to that is I hope that we're vigilant both about what could go wrong with this new technology, while we're also mindful of the fact that we humans have not done a superb job in how we treat one another. It's not like, oh, the bias of the machine, as if humans, I mean, you'd almost, if you knew nothing, I like if you came here on a spaceship and you just read our newspapers today, you would think that racism began with technology. Like there was none before AI, because we talk so much about the potential harms of AI. Humans, we do more harm to one another. There is some opportunity for the AI to actually make things more equitable, to create more access. That is a real opportunity. I don't think that's just propaganda. I actually think that's true, if for no other reasons that we humans have done such a horrible job in how we treat one another. It's not all bad. I'm just saying that, that it's not like it was fine and then the machines messed up everything. I do think that one of the great examples and lessons to be learned from the EU legislation, one is that there is the essential nature of having centralized leadership. And that's what the EU is. It's not even a country, it's different nations, it's a block of nations. And you have the EU Commission, that sits around that and tries to manage the policy. They're sort of like a light touch legislation across those countries. And even though there are different nation states, the fact that EU bloc has been able to create a lot of binding agreements around many things, right? They worked on lots of things, so the EU legislation is, by that time, they built this muscle memory. They know how to do things together. You need to have, I'll put it this way, even if you look at the rationale that's coming from the federal government in the US, which is not just seeking to stifle, but also punish states that regulate AI. I'm not persuaded, we can debate the sincerity of it all, but the claim is that if there's just a patchwork of laws and companies have to work across states, because it's not like Microsoft software is used only in one state, then that actually creates real challenges for companies to create and design products that are compliant. And so the EU actually solves that because it's one consistent thing, right? And yeah, and so I think that is vital. And there, in the United States loves to find anything negative to say about China, and I think it makes it harder. I think there are lessons to be learned all over the place. I think there are lessons to be learned from China. They've lifted more humans out of poverty than any other country in the world. That can be learned. Surely there's something that you learn. One of the things that they're doing actually is very robust regulation of AI. Same thing. It's centralized. There's standards around it. They don't want. They're giving all kinds of support to private companies. They're not against private. They pump money right into private, and they don't want them to become so powerful that the ability to govern technology becomes impossible. And I think that's a lesson. How should it be done? I don't know, that's complicated. But the point is that they're also regulating this over multiple dimensions of finance and healthcare. So I think that's a lesson to be learned. And the last thing I'll say on that is I was in conversation with the Virginia legislature about this. They're trying to create policy to regulate AI in healthcare for all the obvious reasons you already know about, because it can't be the Wild West. And even if you say, well, we don't want to regulate AI, well, you can't. If you rob a bank with AI, you can't say, well, there's no AI regulation, so I can't go to jail. It's still illegal to rob the bank. Just because you use AI to do it doesn't mean that it's not regulated. That's why HIPAA still applies to this ChatGPT software. Right? But you have to go beyond existing things if you want to get the benefit from some of this technology. And it would really make everything go faster and more safely if there were federal legislation that were genuine and sincere. Not we're going to make some rules, but we don't really want to stop anything. We're going to take a human-centered approach to this, which doesn't mean we're against the environment. We're going to take a holistic approach to this. We want to have the good impacts, and the policy is going to work that way. Because we don't have that, states are being forced to do something because these products are coming out. And what OpenAI just did 10 days ago or 8 days ago, or however long it was, I think it was last week, what they did, when I had my last medical appointment, which was a month ago, I asked the provider what they thought about this technology, and she told me, she said, look, I have 15 minutes to spend with you. She actually spent 25 minutes with me, which means I took 10 minutes of someone else's time. But she said, I'll be very honest with you. She said, I get 15 minutes to spend with you. And she said, I'm not typing at the computer right now. I've turned off the monitor, but I'm supposed to be facing it and typing into it what you're telling me. She said, it takes me 10 minutes to do that, which means I only have 5 minutes left in my 15-minute window to actually focus on you. Mm-hmm. And so she said, what I choose to do is to not input the data when I meet with the humans, which means when I get home, if I saw 20 people that day, or 30 people that day, I have to do 30 times that 10 minutes at home. So that's the personal price that she pays. And it's, so she said, I would love it if this technology could actually help with some things so I can focus on the human. So there is a role to play with the technology. And at the same time, if there's not the right policy around it, it can go bad. And there's an example I want to give, but I've been talking too much. I can say it later. But yeah, I think the big takeaway is a centralized approach. If we don't have that, even though different states are trying to do things, the patchwork critique, even if it's not a sincere critique that's coming from the federal government, it will be a patchwork, and that will create issues. There's the data capture and insights into different data for a patient's information. So what you're raising is the role of AI in diagnosing the most complicated diseases. So for the most complicated cases, the accuracy rate for human doctors, the best human doctors, for the most difficult cases, this is not general, it's the most difficult cases to diagnose, is around 25% roughly, 23, 25, 27. It's around 1/4%, which means it's about 3/4 inaccurate. The close to 75% approximately rate of inaccuracy. So if you get a misdiagnosis, that could be very dangerous. It could be fatal. If there's something that's wrong, it doesn't get caught, and then you die of the thing that didn't get caught. Or you're treated for the wrong thing, and that creates other complications. So there are multiple forms of AI software products that are specifically designed for medical diagnosis. So this is not your typical ChatGPT or Copilot. These are specifically designed just for diagnosing medical disease. Fine-tuned, massive data sets, lots of methodology to get best outcomes. The accuracy rate is 87%. 87%. That means there's still about 13% inaccuracy, but compare that to 77% accuracy for the human doctors. So when human doctors have access to the AI for diagnosis, the accuracy rate goes up to almost 90% for the most difficult diagnoses cases. That saves people's lives, it creates better outcomes, and it's one example of if Microsoft has such a product, Google has such a product, there are other companies that are developing these kinds of products. The importance of getting things right and having an inclusive data set becomes significant because of something a couple of you were raising earlier. You were saying that AI has the capacity to compound the effect of bias. So it's no secret that that women are disproportionately misdiagnosed for things like heart conditions, heart attacks, because so much of the data for understanding how a heart attack presents. What do people look like when they're about to have a heart attack? Most of that has been based on men, not women. And so a lot of women's impending heart attacks have been missed. People have unnecessarily died. Now some of that's starting to be corrected, but the point is that it can compound that. Or it can compound the equitable impact. Just depends on what's in the data. So if you have this type of software that's now becoming available, I've lived in a very small town rural. I grew up in small town Mississippi. I've lived in small town Virginia for many years and still in there frequently. Unlike San Francisco, you might have to drive 40, 50 miles to see a specialist. And they might be the only one. You drive the 50 and you have to drive another 50 or 60 to get to the second specialist. Here you just walk across the street and there are 10 of them. And if you don't like those 10, you cross the block and there are 15 more, right? If you live in a rural area, you have unequal access to expertise, but this software could change that. Right? Just if you live in a small town, you have the same access to Microsoft Word that someone in San Francisco has. Microsoft doesn't care. They sell the same thing to everybody. They don't have a rural version of Microsoft Word versus an urban version. It's all the same thing. And it can be the same thing for medical diagnosis. But if everybody starts using something that does not have equitably represented in the data, right, various communities of people, then you would end up, even unintentionally, now ensuring that whether it's urban or rural, East Coast, West Coast, doesn't matter. The same people are gonna be excluded, or are gonna get deprecated outcomes, inferior outcomes from that product. So your point about the compounded effects is such a significant one. And this is why we're sort of in a critical moment, since these things are getting built now, of making sure that they're designed well if they're going to be implemented. So I will say, I certainly resonate with your point about the need for students to learn how to use the tools and to still struggle, the constructive struggle. So it's like, the example is if you go to the gym, you pay your membership, and then they say, okay, well, welcome to our gym. We have robots that lift the weights for you. All you have to do is stand there. well, you should just get a refund. It's not going to do you any good. The whole point is you're supposed to struggle. That's constructively, because there's non-constructive struggle. But that's how you learn, or that's how you build that muscle. And when you're trying to read something, you're trying to figure it out, and it's difficult, and you get this wrong, and you have to redo that, you learn to do whatever the thing is, how to interpret a story, how to craft an argument, whatever it is. If the AI would just do it for you, you never struggle. It's the robots that just lift the weights. You just go to the gym and stand there. Drink your smoothie and you pretend spray yourself with some water since you're not going to sweat, and then you throw your towel over your shoulder and walk out. And you didn't get the struggle. So that is a real problem that is challenging our educational system. How do we ensure that students still have a constructive experience of struggling to figure out how to do things instead of having the AI just do it? And how do we get them ready to participate in a society where they do need to know how to use these tools? Because your point about the difference between the schools and the workplace is very true. Like when they leave our institutions, my great concern as an educator is that my colleagues and I, we get in our faculty meetings, or we go to our events, and we can come up with all kinds of reasons why, this AI is making everything hard. These students won't even write the paper themselves anymore. And we can easily end up not asking what I think are more important questions. It's important, did the student write this paper to the AI? That's an important question. I'm not saying it isn't important. I think what's even more important is how are we going to help these students to participate in the economy when they leave here? I think that question is actually more important than did they cheat on this paper, even though the cheating question is an important one. And my concern is we're not really talking about that other question. In fact, some of us have gone on record as saying that my job is not to train people for jobs. I'm here for the life of the mind. And I think we should not separate those things. I think that's why I said at the beginning that education has to do multiple things, not just one.
The SIDGE Center: Innovation, Ethics, Ingenuity.
The Northern California Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Community Foundation is dedicated to promoting justice, health, education, and service. Please consider making a donation at NorcalMLK Foundation.org. Every donation makes a difference.